more cynical than the attitude I've just described.
Let's go back to those people who are praying for you, because if you are in fact cured, then they'll take credit for it to some degree and perhaps even describe you as a miracle. Are you a bit nervous about that? Because, for example, we've had 2 cases of spontaneous remission from terminal cancer that allowed very recently the first Australian saint, Mary MacKillop, to become St Mary of the Cross. It only happened a month ago. But the idea of intercession by prayer has certainly not disappeared in the 21st century.
Well, no, it hasn't, and nor will it go away as long as our fear of death persists, which I rather think that it will. We're the only mammals, we're the only primates who do know that we're going to die. And we're the only ones who have made the attempt to award ourselves under certain conditions in afterlife. And it's a very tenacious illusion, and it's very unlikely to be dispelled. Sorry, this sometimes happens. How far back should I go?
That's all right. I'm wondering, have you softened it all, and are you prepared to concede anything at all to the faithful, that there may be some value in it? I mean, the comfort that religious belief, for example, gives to people who are in the same position as you.
Tony, as with a lot of this argument, looking death more closely in the eye, as I have been doing, doesn't teach you much that you didn't already know, surprisingly enough. It focuses it a bit, brings it into quite a sharp relief. But it isn't as if I didn't already know that some people, whether they're sick or whether they're well, derive great comfort from the thought that they have a saviour, that they're a member of a flock, for example. I mean, I personally am incapable of describing myself as a member of a flock for reasons that I hope are self-evident. I'm not a sheep. Some people like to be called sheep and think that they'd like to have a shepherd. And if that makes them feel happy, I must say I think it's a rather contemptible form of happiness, but it doesn't bother me as long as they keep it to themselves. As long as they don't try and make me believe it, as long as they don't try and have it taught in schools, as long as they don't want the government to subsidize it, as long as they don't want to block scientific research in its name or because of it, then that's fine. As Thomas Jefferson said, I don't mind if my neighbor believes in 1 God or 15 gods. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg, as long as he or she leaves me alone. I don't want to even have to know what they think. But will they requite this bargain? Of course not. Of course not. It doesn't really make them happy. They can't be happy till everyone else believes it too. And that's sinister, in my opinion, and creepy.
You've grown to distrust the idea of a utopia.
Yes.
A world, I presume, actually, you would imagine a world without religion would be utopian. But let me ask you this. What do you think a world without religion, without all the cultural side effects of it, would actually look like? I mean, would it be verging on pure commercialism and materialism? I mean, would it take people away from any spiritual side of themselves at all?
Well, no, that wouldn't be it, because as we know from bitter experience, materialism and commercialism are unusually, inordinately compatible with religion. I mean, that's why there've had to be so many successive reformations, because the religious life goes so well with greed and accumulation and acquisition. When asked where they really want power and influence, this world or the next, they tend to think rather the same as the more crass materialists among us do. That doesn't make it any easier to imagine a world without religion. And it's not that I don't think I have too little imagination to imagine that. It's just that I think it cannot, in fact, be imagined. Religion is part of the human makeup. It's also part of our cultural and intellectual history. Religion was our first attempt at literature, the texts, our first attempt at cosmology, making sense of where we are in the universe, our first attempt at healthcare, believing in faith healing, our first attempt at philosophy. All of them very crude, and all of them long since transcended and left behind. But respect for tradition alone makes it, I think, necessary for me to say that someone who doesn't know about religion or doesn't take an interest in it is only quasi-literate.
I'd like to ask you what you think about Martin Amos's idea that writers like you must actually believe in some life after death, because not all of you, not all of the parts of you are going to die, because the printed words you leave behind constitute a form of immortality. You've obviously, I mean, is he just being kind, or do you think that there's a truth to that?
Litera scripta manet. The written word will remain. That's true, but it won't be that much comfort to me. I mean, of course I do write. I've always had the sense of writing, as it were, posthumously. I once wrote an introduction to a collection of my own essays. I stole the formulation from Nadine Gordimer. Said you should try and write as if for post-mortem publication, because only then can you screen out all those influences. Public opinion, some reviewer you might want to be impressing, some publisher you might want to publish you, someone you're afraid of offending, all these distractions. You write purely and honestly and clearly and for its own sake. And the best way of doing that is to imagine that you won't live to see it actually written. Then you can be sure that you're being objective and you're being scrupulous. I think that that's a wonderful reflection, but it doesn't. It isn't the same term as immortality at all. As
you say in your memoirs, you've written for decades, day in, day out. I think you said at least 1,000 words a day for many, many years, dispatches, articles, lectures, books, in particular books. Doesn't it give you some comfort that your thoughts and indeed some version of you is going to exist after your death is imperishable?
Well, if you want to know, because I try to avoid the blues when talking about all this, but if you want to know one of the most sour reflections that I have when I think that I'm 61 now and I might not make 65, I quite easily might not, one of the bitter aspects of that is, well, I put in 60 years sort of at the coalface. I worked very hard. In the last few years, I've got a fair amount of recognition for it. In my opinion, actually, rather more than I deserve. Certainly more than I expected. And I could have looked forward to a few years of, shall we say, cruising speed, you know, just as it were, relishing that, enjoying it, not ceasing to work, not resting on the laurels, but savoring it a bit. And that, I was just getting ready for that, as a matter of fact. I was hit right at the top of my form, right in the middle of a successful book tour. I'm not going to get that, and that does upset me. So that's how I demarcate it from immortality. Similarly, I'm not going to see my grandchildren, almost certainly not. One has children in the expectation of dying before them. In fact, you want to make damn sure you die before them, just as you'll plant a tree or build a house. Hoping that it will outlive you. That's how the human species has done as well as it has. The great Cuban writer Jose Marti said that a man, he happened to say it was a man, 3 duties: to write a book, to plant a tree, and to have a son. I remember the year my first son was born was the year I published my first real full-length book. And I had a book party for it and for him, Alexander, my son, and I planted a tree, a weeping willow. I felt pretty good for the age of, what, I think 32 or something. But the thought of mortality, in other words, of being outlived, is fine when it's your children, your books, or your trees, but it doesn't reconcile you to an early death. No, it doesn't.
Is it only people outside of your existence then who can actually romanticize this idea of the immortal Hitchens?
Well, people write to me, and it does, I will say this, having, surrendered briefly to the blues there, but I don't want to put on any false front. I mean, in the same way, by the same token, there are people who write to me and say that what I've done or written has meant something to them, that I haven't wasted my time, that my life's been worth living. That's very nice too, but I'd like to have hung around and got more such letters.
It's interesting you should say that, because that's actually where I plan to end this part of our interview, because I do plan to give my sons letters to a young contrarian, and I really hope that they then pass it on to their children. And to me, whatever that means to you, that's kind of immortality, but it's something that that only people who've been following you for years can actually do.
Well, you couldn't have said a nicer thing, and I hope you would have said it. I'm sure you would, anyway. And I have to have, I'm afraid, they're the same response. I'd like to have heard even more people say that, and even met some of their grandchildren, and seen if it worked for them too. And this I won't get, but I've lived longer than I used to think I probably would. I've written and published more than I thought I would. It's been better received than I expected, and without being falsely modest, in some cases better than I think I deserve. So don't mistake this for self-pity. But I'm not going to resort to any kind of bogus joviality either.
Christopher Hitchens, we'll leave you there for now. In the way of things, we're going to come back to you again tomorrow. We thank you for...
If I'm spared. Inshallah.